Good. And we will make a start. So welcome to Consciousness Club, everyone. Thanks for joining. Do feel free to put your cameras on if you wish. And it's nice to see some faces. If you can just make sure you've got yourselves on mute during the main part of the presentation to avoid any interference. As Consciousness Club regulars will know, we'll record the main part of the meeting, we'll then stop the recording, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and Q&A. So it is my real pleasure to be introducing Caroline Dicey Jennings. I've known Caroline for a few years now. She got her undergraduate degree in philosophy in the UK at the University of St Andrews, then did a PhD in philosophy at Boston University, before joining the faculty at University of California, Merced, where she was promoted to full professor last year in 2023. And we've just been talking about how she's spending some time at Berkeley on sabbatical this autumn. So Caroline's work is based in philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience, so really at this interdisciplinary intersection, and is aiming at understanding the nature of attention and its impact on the mind. And she's recently outlined her views in a book with Cambridge University Press called The Attending Mind. So thanks so much for joining us for Consciousness Club, Caroline, and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to start, especially with that background, just by mentioning that this will be a philosophical talk. I know this is an interdisciplinary group and I have interdisciplinary roots, but this talk is more about the concept of consciousness and how we should understand it. It does have implications for the science of consciousness, and we can talk a little bit about that too, but just to preface that. Also, for people who are familiar with my work, or actually for people who aren't as well, I have a background on attention. I have a couple of books on that. So one, Steve just mentioned, this is backwards for some reason, The Attending Mind. That was 2020. And then another one, this is a short one called The Cambridge Element on attention and mental control. And this work really comes out of that work because in that work, I argue that attention provides evidence for a self or subject, and I address arguments on the relationship between attention and consciousness. One of my arguments in The Attending Mind, this earlier one from 2020, is that attention is not necessary for consciousness. And that's a somewhat controversial view, as I'm sure many of you know. Some of my previous, prior to working on that, my favorite theories of consciousness in the sciences see attention as necessary for consciousness. So because of these arguments of mine that attention is not necessary for consciousness, I wanted to think about what consciousness could be, how we might understand it if that's the case. And that led to this project, this Consciousness as Relation project. So what I'll be arguing is that consciousness is a relation between a subject and their world. I will be arguing that attention is necessary for that subject to exist, but attention is not necessary for the subject to be engaged with its world. And so that's why I don't think, or that's how it's consistent with this earlier work of mine on attention not being necessary for consciousness. Okay, so that's a little bit of background. The structure of this talk, I'm planning to talk for 45 minutes. I'll try to keep an eye on the time to stay true to that, and I hope that we'll have a good amount of time for questions. There are 5 basic sections of the talk. I'll give a little bit of background on the concepts of relations and consciousness. I'll provide the argument for why you should think consciousness is a relation. I'll provide a little bit of history on this idea of relationism, as I'm calling it, and some other people have called it, and how my own view fits into that history of relationism. And then finally, I'll, if we have time, I'll talk about some objections you might have to the view. And then I hope that I'll hear a lot more objections, but I'll just provide a few early objections you might have and my responses to those. So that's the structure of the talk. So we're starting with background. So the first thing that I want to talk about is what relations are. The reason that this is important is largely for philosophers or people who are familiar with philosophy on relations. I think that the concept of relations, that concept is familiar to most of us. For most of us, we think of the world as made up of both objects and relations. However, in philosophy, relations have a really contested history. And so even though that's familiar to most of us, philosophers have raised a lot of objections to the idea that there could be relations that exist in the world. So for this first part, I'm going to just review this concept of relations, a couple of those problems, and talk about how we might understand relations for the purpose of this talk. Objects are the most familiar thing that we talk about when we think of the things that exist. We usually think of objects. Objects are things that have clear boundaries. They are localizable for the most part. Relations are things that exist between objects and are not easily localizable, do not have clear boundaries. And those are some of the reasons why philosophers have found problems with them. Okay. So over 100 years ago, Bliss brought up this problem that I mentioned, that philosophy has found it challenging to define relations. Bliss wrote in 1915, the attempt to define relation has usually led to the admission that whatever is meant by it is indefinable in simpler terms. To talk about it, I wanted to start by doing a quick little example. So if you would open your chat, what I'm hoping you'll do is tell me some of the objects that you see in this moving image and some of the relations. So let me know what you see. List some objects and some relations. Nice. Okay, good. So people are noticing that there's a person, there's a chair, there's a relation of onness, the man on the chair. Somebody's listing the parts of the man. There's a man, a yellow suit, a thumb, the Converse sneakers, another relation of onness, a relation of wearing. The man's wearing shoes, shoes on feet. That's another relation. Man sitting on a chair. That's a relation, raising the thumb. Intention and thumb. Spinning, maybe this motion of spinning has been, so maybe this, you could see the relation of spinning relative to maybe the background. You could see that as a relation. Okay, good. Okay, so these are pretty much the same things that were noted by the chat, that some of the objects that we might talk about are the person and the chair. These words unary and binary are terms that come from mathematics, and that's just to note that the properties of objects are typically unary. That is, they typically apply to one thing, just the object. So for the person, we might say that they have these unary properties of being yellow. Well, the person's not yellow, but let's just skip over that. And biological. The properties of relations are considered binary. Of course, relations can be between more than two things, so they're binary plus. But that, what I mean by that is that the properties of relations hold between two or more relata. They're not unary. So for example, you might note the relation of spatial proximity. Some people noted that. So you would say there's a relation of spatial proximity between the person and the chair. You might say that the person is on the chair or the chair is under the person. And note that that different way of talking, on and under, usually when we talk about relational properties, we talk about them from the perspective of one of the objects. So we say the person is on the chair, we say the chair is under the person, and those are two different relational properties that hold of the relation. We could also talk about causal friction. So if you notice here at the end of the little movement, the person uses their foot to stop. I don't know if anybody noticed that. So he uses his converse against the chair to stop. So there's a relation also, a causal relation of friction of stopping and being stopped. Okay, so these, hopefully everybody felt very comfortable listing those objects and relations. They should be easy to recognize in the world. Okay, so what about the philosophical problems? Why are people concerned about relations? Why do people think they might not exist? The main problem is something called Bradley's regress. Bradley was a philosopher from over 100 years ago. 100 years ago. So Bradley's regress, I'll describe it in a second, but because of that problem, as Marmadora and Yates noted in 2016, Western philosophy has largely discussed relations actually in terms of individuals and their intrinsic properties. So relations have pretty much gone out of the discourse in philosophy. We talk about objects and their properties, but we don't typically talk about relations. Okay, so here's Bradley's regress. You might ask yourself the question about relations, whether we can treat them as separable from the objects. So when we talk about, for example, the relation of onness between the person and the chair, could we treat that relation as separable from both the person and the chair? As you can imagine, as this like black dot, for example, maybe that's where the relation is. It's between the person and the chair there, where that black dot is. If so, then you would want to ask the question of how that thing, the third thing that's separate from the person in the chair, the relation, how it's related to both the person and the chair. So if we're going to talk about the relation as separable from the person in the chair, then we're going to have an understanding of how it is related to the person in the chair. And of course, if you try to figure out how that third thing is related to the person in the chair, then you're going to have to introduce new relations. We might call those relation person and relation chair to represent the relation between the relation and the person and the relation in the chair. But then the same problem would be introduced again. We would have to come up with how those other new objects are related to the person in the chair. And we would have to introduce new relations, and you'd get an infinite regress. So this would be a vicious regress. This is called Bradley's regress, or Bradley's problem of relations. So this is really a problem of, oh, sorry, let me go back. This is really a problem of thinking of relations as separable from objects. Sometimes people talk about this as thinking of relations as external to the objects, which is why many philosophers only talk about relational properties that are inside of objects. They're not comfortable with the idea of relations as outside of objects. Okay, another problem that philosophers have with relations are that they're non-localizable. I introduced relations at the start that way. I think that they are the kinds of things that are difficult to draw boundaries around. They're difficult to localize in space. But for some philosophers, that makes them suspicious. So this is McBride in 2020. McBride wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry for relations, metaphysics of relations. And he says that some philosophers are wary of admitting relations because they're difficult to locate. So what I'm going to do for this talk, when I'm talking about consciousness as a relation, I'm going to ask you to think of relation as a placeholder for that which is the basis of and explains relational properties. So all philosophers, I should never say all philosophers. I think most philosophers are comfortable with the concept of relational properties, even if they sometimes want to say they're inside of the objects. They seem like they're comfortable with the idea that there's onness and underness, for example. So whatever it is that explains why you have onness and underness, that's what we're going to call the relation. And I want you to think of relational properties themselves as onness and underness as adhering to the relata. And the reason that I want you to do that is that if you think of relations as adhering to, if you think of relational properties as adhering to the relation, then you're invoking a vehicle, then you're going to have to invoke a vehicle for those relational properties, and you're going to get back to the Bradley's regress problem. So relations have properties, but those properties adhere to the objects rather than to the relation itself. And I think that we can set aside this issue of whether relations are internal or external. Relations, as I see them, are not entirely inside objects, nor are they entirely separable from objects. Relations depend on the relata, but they don't exist inside of them. So I think that internal-external debate isn't that helpful, at least for our purposes. So relations for me are things that require relata, two or more relata, exist between the relata, do not contain the relata, and explain relational properties. Consciousness. So I think probably everyone here is really familiar with the concept of consciousness, but I think it's useful for this talk to actually to return to some basics on this, just to see how the more familiar way of thinking about consciousness is different from what I'm proposing here. When I use the word consciousness, what I'm talking about is the philosophical concept of consciousness, that which grounds phenomenal consciousness and is referred to in the hard problem. So by hard problem, I mean, how does consciousness come about in the natural world? So when people are asking those kinds of questions, that's what I'm trying to get at with this talk. How does consciousness come about in the natural world? If we understand consciousness as a relation, I think we can get a lot closer to a solution to that problem. More familiar than the idea that consciousness could be a relation is the idea that consciousness is an object or substance. So if you're someone who thinks that consciousness is the brain or is a part of the brain, and believe me, if you don't believe that, there are people who have that view. I've heard many times that consciousness is the prefrontal cortex, for example. So if you're that kind of person, you're thinking of consciousness as an object or as a substance. But likewise, if you're a substance dualist, a Cartesian dualist, you also see consciousness as an object or substance. So if you think of consciousness not as the brain, but as in this little cartoon, as something that kind of floats above the brain, separate from the brain, you're thinking of it as an object or substance. Clues to whether you think you're thinking of consciousness as an object or substance, or whether you think it has clear boundaries and whether you think it's localizable. Typically, if you think those things, if you're thinking of consciousness as something that's like in space somewhere with clear boundaries that you can point to, usually you're thinking of it as an object or a substance. Also popular in philosophy is the idea that consciousness could be a property rather than an object, so a property of an object. You might think of it as a property, for example, of the brain. So you might say that consciousness is not the brain or a part of the brain, but it's one of the properties that the brain has. So if you're familiar with the concept of qualia, qualia is short for qualitative properties. That's where that idea is coming from, is the idea that maybe brain activity has both the property of being electrical and the property of qualia. So this is often people are property dualists when they have this view. And that's why I've got the two little cat heads. I have no idea what the text says. Okay. The most popular view in philosophy is that consciousness is a function. I think when they've done surveys of philosophers, something like 60% of philosophers think consciousness is a function. And what that means is basically that they see consciousness as what is done to stimuli to get a response. So consciousness is the work that is done, the stuff that is done to the stimulus to get the response. And many people find the metaphor of a machine useful here. So this is a machine doing something, I don't know, to these nuts. I'm not really sure. It's like maybe turning them into liquid. So you would think of consciousness, if you think of like the nuts or whatever those are, as the stimuli and the creation of liquid as the response. The idea is that consciousness is whatever's in between those two things, the work that's being done on the stimuli to get the response. Okay, so the view that I'm trying to push here, the topic of this talk, is that consciousness is a relation between a subject and their world. Now, I'm just going to go back a second. You could see functionalism as a kind of relationism. In a way, a function is a relation between a stimulus and response. It's just a relation that does work. It's not a mirror relation, it's a relation plus. But even if you see functionalism as a type of relationism, this is a very different type of relationism because it's not between a stimulus and a response, it's between a subject and their world. So if you remember at the start, I said that there are these different things, there are objects and there are relations. The idea is that a subject and a world would be like objects, and that consciousness would be a relation between those objects, rather than a third object or a property of an object or even a function. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to get to. So the second part of this talk is going to be an argument. Why should you think that consciousness is a relation? And this is a fairly straightforward argument. I haven't yet found it to be very convincing to people who are not me, but we'll see how you react. Okay, so the first part of the argument is that I look at what I take to be the core characteristics of consciousness. I actually think that I could do this argument with many of their characteristics people have listed about consciousness, but for the sake of brevity and to be less controversial, I'm just focusing on the two that I think are the most widely accepted and acknowledged. And those are that consciousness is subjective and intentional. By subjective, I mean that it's experienced as though by a subject. That's probably the most commonly cited property of consciousness. It's widely considered to be essential to consciousness, that it's subjective. And intentional, by that I mean experienced as though about something. Intentional here does not mean the same thing as purposeful. The word intentional has in philosophy has this older history, and intentionality itself, that word unfortunately has both meanings, but I mean the older meaning, this idea of directedness or aboutness rather than being purposive. So consciousness is talked about as both being subjective by most people and intentional, that it's about things. Okay, so I take those to be two essential characteristics of consciousness that are not controversial. Even though consciousness has those two characteristics, those the subjective and intentional, it does not clearly contain within it either subject or world. This too, I don't think is a very controversial premise. Even people who have very different views of consciousness than I do have argued that consciousness does not contain the subject within it. In fact, they've used that to argue against the existence of the subject because consciousness does not contain the subject. They say subject must not exist. On the other point, this is widely acknowledged by representationalists. So I'm not committed to representationalism in this talk, but for people who are committed to representationalism, this idea that perception is made up of representations, they believe that the world is not contained within consciousness. Instead, you have representations of the world in consciousness. So again, I don't think this is very controversial that consciousness does not contain either the subject or the world, but this is another important premise of the argument. Okay, so the third premise, maybe the more controversial one, would be that the most straightforward explanation of those two pieces, that you have these two essential characteristics of consciousness, subjective and intentional, and consciousness does not contain either the subject or the world, that which it is about, is that consciousness is a relation between a subject and its world. Otherwise, you'd have to come up with an explanation of why it seems like it's about the subject and about the world without containing them. Like where do those qualities come from, if not from the actual subject and world that it's between? I think it's helpful sometimes to make an analogy with some other relations to think about consciousness here. So I'll make two. I'll talk about marriage and speed. So marriage, the kinship relation is a very familiar relation for many of us. Marriage is a relation between two or more persons that does not contain those persons. So if you thought, and one of the reasons I'm using this cartoon is I think it's helpful to visualize the point I want to make here. If you think of relations as a third thing between these two people, then when you think of the marriage, you would have to like say that, okay, the marriage is like something in between these two individuals. And then you might ask yourself, if I were to make a duplicate of these two individuals, would we also have marriage or not? That might be a problem for you. Like, I'm not really sure if marriage would come along with those two people, even if you had an exact duplicate of those two people. And that's because you're thinking of it as like a third thing that would also have to be duplicated. But if you treat marriage as a relation between them, it's not a third thing in between them, but it relies on the two of them, then a duplicate of the two people would come along with marriage if you have a perfect duplicate of the two people, because by having them, you have their interactions, then you get marriage for free because it's the relation between them. Okay, so maybe it's not obvious, but I'm making the same point about consciousness here, that I think some of the mysteries about consciousness, like if you made a duplicate of our world, would you have consciousness or not? I think go away when you think of consciousness as a relation. And then with speed, speed is a relation between two objects, the object measuring and the object measured. It can also be between the object measured and some kind of other standpoint that you're comparing it to, but it's between two objects. We like to think of speed as just being about the object measured, but it does require you to have a specific frame in order to calculate the speed. But that relation is not, but those objects, the objects being measured and the measurer, they're not contained within the speed. The speed is between the two of them. So similarly, I'm saying consciousness is not in the subject, it's not in the world, it's between the two of them. Okay, so that argument that consciousness has this property of pointing to the subject and pointing to a world without containing the two, and that for that reason, we should see consciousness as a relation between the two. That's kind of my starting point for this talk. But for the rest of the talk, I want to give you a little bit of the history of this idea of relationism. Relationism being the name I'm giving the view that consciousness is a relation between a subject and their world, and then how my view fits within that history. Okay, so I'm going to do this through talking about three phases of relationism. People who are familiar with the work I'm going to talk about may not realize that these people have relationist views because their views are very different from one another. So for that reason, I'm separating them into relationism 1.0, relationism 2.0, and I'm calling my own relationism 3.0. And I think it'll be clear why I'm doing that in a second. Okay, my perspective on relationism 1.0 is that it's too focused on the subject. So if you think of relationism as the view that consciousness is a relation between the subject and their world, I think relationism 1.0 ignores the world too much and focuses too much on the subject part. Okay, so people who are responsible for this view include Ernst Mach, who all of these people were writing about 100 years ago. Ernst Mach had a piece in 1897 where he argued that consciousness is a relation. William James has several pieces, including 1904 and 1905. Montague and Woodbridge, and finally Nishida a few years later, if you're familiar with Japanese philosophy, 1911 has this view. The idea that they put forward is the idea that consciousness is a relation within experience. So they talk about consciousness as a relation between a subject and their world, but the subject and world both exist within experience and are created by experience. I want to just note that there's asterisks on Montague and Woodbridge because their views are slightly different from the other ones, but I'm just going to omit that for right now. Their views are closer to my view, actually. Okay, so James, for example, in 1904, William James wrote that knowledge lives inside the tissue of experience. It is made and made by relations that enroll themselves in time. In 1922, Erickson wrote a book about different theories of consciousness, and he labeled that trend, that early trend with William James and Mach, he labeled that the consciousness as relation trend. And he thought of William James as the key representative of that trend. And as he saw it, that trend of thinking of consciousness as a relation was replaced by 1922 with the idea that consciousness is a function, which he saw as advocated by Dewey and others. And of course, by 1960, functionalism, this idea that consciousness is a function, completely took over the way that philosophers were thinking about consciousness. Okay, so the relationism 1.0 is from over 100 years ago. It's been largely forgotten, especially under the rubric of relationism, that idea that it's about relation. We use different terms to refer to it. We talk about James's neutral monism, for example. But they did have the idea that consciousness was a relation between a subject and their world. They just thought that those things all existed within experience, with the exception of Woodbridge and Montague. Relationism 2.0, as I'm describing it, is, I think, too focused on the world, whereas relationism 1.0 is too focused on the subject. Everything they're talking about is within experience. I think relationism 2.0 is omits the subject too much from their account. So what I'm thinking of here are the philosophers John Campbell, for example. He has a book called Reference and Consciousness, published in 2002. Fish, 2008. Brewer, 2013 and 21. If you're familiar with these people, you may or may not be familiar with the fact that they call themselves relationists. One of the reasons for that is that people also refer to these views as being direct realism. So sometimes they call it relationism, sometimes they call it direct realism. The view that these people put forward is that consciousness or conscious perception is a relation with external objects. So they're famous for saying that we can explain perception by talking about actual objects in the world. They were objecting to representationalism. They were objecting to the idea that what conscious perception is about are representations within the mind, and they wanted to talk about the actual world that's part of conscious perception. But nonetheless, they talked about it as a relation between the subject and that external world. So for example, here's Fish 2008. He said, the key to the relationist explanation of what it is like to have an experience turns on the claim that in this picture, phenomenal properties are relational properties, relations between subjects and real world instances of properties. So you might think that sounds really similar to what I'm doing in what I'm trying to argue for. It sounds like they're saying something very similar. However, when they talk about the subject, it's really minimal in their view. So Campbell, let me actually see if I can make this. Nope. Let me see if I can make it a little bit larger. Okay, sorry, I'm not gonna try to do that because it's too hard. I'm sorry if you can't read this. I'll read it out loud. In Campbell 2002, for example, he says that if you had two ordinary observers standing in roughly the same place, looking at the same scene, that they would have the same experience with the same phenomenal character. So the subject, whatever the subject is, can't be doing a lot of work because two totally separate people that are standing in a similar position would have the exact same experience. So it really seems like the object is driving the experience rather than the person. And Brewer 2021 says that the relevant worldly constituents, the actual objects in the world, together with the subject's spatiotemporal posit and orientation, so literally like your spatiotemporal position and the circumstances of perception, so the lighting or whatever, give you access to the subjective nature of their perceptual experience. So once you know where in space the person is standing, and once you know the object, then you know exactly what they're seeing. So that's a pretty minimal concept of a subject. All you really need to know is their spatiotemporal location. And I have a very different notion of a subject. I think that this subject is too thin. Okay. So part 4, this is the part of the talk where I'm going to say how my view fits into the history of relationism. So these earlier phases, I think, have placed consciousness either in the realm of the subject, relationism 1.0, William James, Ernst Mach, those kinds of people, or in the realm of the world, relationism 2.0. And actually, Fish admits in a footnote that he thinks that this seems like it kicks the problem to a new level. That is either upstairs in phase 1 or downstairs in phase 2. What I mean by that is that if you think of relationism as bridging two levels between the subject and their world, it seems like with relationism 1.0, they solve the problem just by talking about the subject, just by talking about experience. Relationism 2.0, it seems like they solve the problem just by talking about the world. So what I want to do instead is I want to make a case for relationism by explaining why we need consciousness. What are the subject and the world? We would need to have subject and world be separated and require consciousness in order for consciousness to be a solution to this problem. So to give a full account of relationism, I think you need to have an account of how the subject is separable from its world, and why consciousness needs to relate one to the other. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to do with relationism 3.0, as I'm calling it. I'm trying to give an account of how the subject is separable from its world in natural terms, and thus why consciousness is a relation between the two. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about the organism world boundary, because I think that that helps to see why there's a subject world boundary. For this, I'm relying on some earlier work. So if you're familiar with work by, for example, Evan Thompson has work on the organism world boundary. Anytime you've heard someone talk about autopoiesis or homeostasis, they've been talking about this kind of thing. The idea is that all living beings have an organism world boundary. Seaweed has an organism world boundary. One explanation of how this comes about is that there's this law of thermodynamics that entropy in general increases, that that things tend to kind of fall apart over time. But that's not true for living beings. And it's not true for living beings because they maintain this organism world boundary. They decrease their personal entropy at the expense of their environment. They take resources in order to organize themselves and decrease personal entropy or decrease organism entropy. Okay, so the organism world boundary is between that which is protected and that which is used to decrease entropy. You could think of it as we're talking about material stuff here, the material stuff that is protected and the material stuff that is used in order to protect the organism. So this is a natural explanation. What is the difference between a subject and an organism? So my argument is that consciousness is a relation between a subject and its world, not between an organism and its world. To make the case that there is a subject world divide that requires consciousness, I think we're going to want to have not simply an organism world boundary, because I think you can explain that. I think you can explain this boundary through, for example, self-organization, local interactions at the cell level. I don't think you need any kind of emergence or organization. I don't think you need anything like a subject and their world to explain what's happening with the organism world boundary. So why I think we have this bridge of consciousness between a subject and their world is because of the emergence of the subject. So what's the difference between a subject and an organism? We standardly call that which drives the shape and the maintenance of the organism world boundary the organism's interests. You could also think, sometimes people use the word drives. Those are the things that are important to the organism that allow it to maintain that boundary between itself and the world. When I use the word subject, I'm talking about the collection of all of those interests. So all the interests of the organism are the subject in my view. So the seaweed that we saw before, you have this boundary between the seaweed and everything else. The seaweed has maybe the interest in a specific pH. It might have the interest in a specific temperature. It might have an interest in not being eaten by these fish and jellyfish. It has multiple interests, and the subject would be the collection of all of those interests. When we have multiple interests, when an organism has multiple interests, and all organisms have multiple interests, those interests can drive the shape and maintenance of that boundary, the organism world boundary, in more or less unified ways. So the interests can work on their own to help maintain that boundary. They can work locally, but they can also work in coordinated ways. When I talk about attention in my own work, what I've argued, for example, in this Attending Mind book, is that attention is the coordination of those interests. So when resources are distributed to favored interests and away from disfavored interests, that's what I call attention. For the collection of interests, that whole group of interests, to start regulating the impact of individual interests through something like attention, the subject has to be emergent. And this is also something that I've argued in this other work. What I mean by that is that you don't get a collection of interests making a difference to the impact of an individual interest unless that collection has some new power or ability to control. And that new power or ability to control justifies us talking about it as separable from its individual components. So the subject is just all of its interests, but it's all of its interests plus the ability to constrain its individual interests. And that ability to constrain its individual interests is why we can talk about it as separable to some degree from the individual. Okay, so that's what I mean by emergent. I don't mean that there's some kind of totally new magical thing. It is the collection plus the power to control its parts. This emergence of a subject is what creates a subject world boundary. So instead of just an organism world boundary, which could be based on self-organization and local interactions, a subject world boundary comes about, I think, because of this control of the whole over its parts. When you start having the control of the collection over its parts, then you're introducing a boundary between that and that which is modified by it. So you could think of it as the organism world boundary is about the stuff that is protected and the stuff that is used, whereas the subject world boundary is about the thing that is doing the protecting, this organized collection of interests, and that which is targeted by that organized collection. So it's closely related to the organism world boundary, but it's occurring at another level. Okay, so the division between an emergent subject and their world can thus be specified in natural terms. What I mean by that, it's we can understand this as something that exists in the natural world. It doesn't exist in some other plane. It's not separable from the kinds of things that we're studying in science. And because it can be specified in natural terms, we can think of these things as the relata of consciousness, the natural relata of consciousness. So consciousness is a relationship between the world. It's a relation between these objects. One of these objects being the collection of interests, and the other object being all that which is modified by that collection of interests. Okay, so you might already be thinking, so you could see this as a kind of like early objection. Excuse me. What about the directionality of consciousness? If consciousness is just the relation between this collection of interests and all that is modified by it, then why does consciousness feel so different from the perspective of the subject in the world? So from the perspective of a subject, it really feels like we have access to something that other people don't have access to. Color, for example, seems like it's really special to us. It's something that belongs to us. Whereas from the perspective of the world, when we look at conscious agents, it seems like we don't have access to those colors. It seems like we're aware of their consciousness in a kind of indirect way. So it seems like there's a kind of asymmetry to the relation. So how is it that I'm claiming that consciousness is a mirror relation between a subject and their world, given this asymmetry? To explain a little bit of that, like why it is that consciousness is asymmetrical in this way, it's like a special kind of relation. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of interests and the bodily interface, because I think both help to explain why consciousness has some of the characteristics it does, why it's a special kind of relation. So in the nature of interests are already in themselves asymmetrical. So the concept of a drive or an interest is something that is directed at something else. A drive or an interest, you could also, if you think back to like what are drives or interests doing, they are protecting that organism world boundary. And what is the purpose of that? It's to reduce entropy within the organism at the expense of its environment. So that second law of thermodynamics shows up in another place, which I think is sometimes useful for thinking about this when we think of a difference between the past and the future. So ignoring the concept of a subjective present, if you think of the objective present, that is whatever the relation between past and future is, the future has more entropy than the past, according to that second law of thermodynamics. So that relation is asymmetrical because there's a one direction increase in entropy. So if you can imagine that you're in the past looking toward the future, you're on one side of that relation, what you would expect is that the future would look more open because there's this increase in entropy, there's this increase in things falling apart, there's less certainty about what's going to happen. Whereas if you're in the position of the future, looking to the past, if you're on that side of the relation, you would expect things to look more orderly because in that direction, entropy is decreasing. So there is a difference between the two, if you think of them as relata, these two relata of the past and the future, when you think of the relation of present between them. So I think something similar is going on with the subject-world relation, that there just is a difference because of this directionality of interests between the positionality of the subject looking to the world and the position of the world looking at the subject. The other reason I think that consciousness is special or strange or whatever is that all of this is happening through the bodily interface. And that's what this weird cartoon is about, if you were wondering why that's up there. So when I think of the subject, I think of it in terms of the brain. I don't want to say that it's impossible to have a subject without a brain, but I'm limiting, when I discuss a subject, I limit it to the brain because that is what That's what we know in the human case is, strongly corresponds with consciousness. So when we think of a subject as based in the brain and brain activity, we know that the job of the brain is to control the nervous system. That's what it's doing. So whatever the interests are doing at the brain level is going to be about controlling the body in some kind of way, other parts of the body in some kind of way. So consciousness, if it is about controlling individual interests by the collection of interests, that's all happening through a bodily interface. We can't be conscious of things directly because we're conscious of things through our body. And similarly, if you're outside of the subject of your world trying to observe a conscious subject, you're trying to observe a conscious agent as a scientist, then you're observing them through their bodily interface. And so there's a kind of indirectness of the relation from both sides. I think both of those things give consciousness some of its unusual qualities. All right, so the fifth part, and I can see I've spoken for 40 something minutes, so I don't want to go through all of these in detail. So maybe I'll just introduce some of these objections and not go too much into the responses. And then if people are interested in these objections, then we can return to them. But there's three objections that I hear from people sometimes about this. There are more, but these are three of them. One is that consciousness is intuitively more primitive than attention. So a subject that is able to direct attention cannot be required for consciousness. So this is what philosophers often argue, is that it can't be the case that attention comes before consciousness because consciousness is more basic. I'm going to skip my response. But we can come back to that if people are interested in that. Basically, I just say that I think that's wrong. Okay. So, second objection is that consciousness is not always subjective or intentional. So you might be thinking, for example, of altered states. So if you thought during that original argument I gave in section 2, well, I'm saying that consciousness has these two essential properties of being subjective and intentional, and the best explanation of that, given that the subject and world do not exist within consciousness, is that consciousness is a relation. Okay, but you might say, I disagree with the first step. I disagree that consciousness is essentially subjective and intentional. And one of the reasons I disagree is because in altered states, sometimes consciousness does not seem to be there does not seem to be a subject, and maybe it doesn't seem to be about the world. Again, I'm happy to come back to this. On this one, I agree that consciousness is not always subjective and intentional, and I don't think that that's a problem for the view, but I'm happy to return to that. Okay, finally, another objection is that relations seem incoherent. Again, this is a kind of philosophical objection, so philosophers are concerned about whether relations make any sense metaphysically. So for that view, they just think all relations are incoherent and we should reject them. So it's not helpful to see consciousness as a relation because all relations don't make any sense. And I'm going to skip over my response to that. Okay, so a quick summary of what I've been trying to do here. What I've been trying to argue is that this view of relationism, that consciousness is a relation rather than an object or a property, that can set a new metaphysical foundation for consciousness, for the study of consciousness, from this idea of object or property or even function to thinking of it as a relation between the subject and their world. While previous versions of relationism, I think, focused too much on either the subject or on the world, and I think that led to problems for the views. This account provides a natural basis of each, and I think gives a better justification of why consciousness should be seen as a relation between them. If you're wondering what kinds of directionality this might give scientists, like why does this matter at all for the sciences? The kind of thing I think a scientist might be interested in from this is how can we separate in neurophysiology interests from their contents? So if you think, for example, of the work of Marissa Carrasco showing that attention can sometimes be indistinguishable from contrast. So contrast being something we might think of as a content or part of the world, something we assign to the objects that we observe, and attention having to do with our interests. sometimes those two things seem like they mesh together, or it's difficult to tell when it's attention and when it's the world, or when it's an interest or when it's the world. But we know that they're separable. We know that our interests are separable from the contents that they modify, even if sometimes they're difficult to distinguish. So how can we separate the two in neurophysiology? What is an interest? How should we make sense of it in neuroscience? And what is a content, and how should we make sense of it? So one of the questions I think that this kind of research would point to is that if we're trying to study consciousness, we don't need to think of consciousness as a third thing. We just need to study what a subject is and what their world is. And once we understand what a subject is and what their world is, then the interactions between the two just are consciousness. So we can limit our scientific exploration to those other questions. Okay. All right. Thank you. And I welcome your questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Carolyn. Let's give you a round of applause, first of all.
Okay.
That was great and super clear, very engaging. And I also love the animations. These are lovely. I'm sure there will be plenty to talk about. I'm just going to stop the recording.